Okay, so we're back, and we're going to switch gears now and move into qualitative research. So feel free to sing along if you know the words. Quantitative research and qualitative research are not just two different ways of doing research, but two different ways of thinking about doing research. Therefore, it's kind of confusing for students sometimes who are encountering these concepts for the first time to flip back and forth between the two paradigms. Just keep in mind that qualitative research is guided by a totally different set of assumptions than quantitative research. In fact, qual researchers don't even use the term validity. They used to at one point, but they don't anymore because it carries too much quantitative baggage with it. Unfortunately, some people, mostly old school quant researchers, often make these cross-paradigm criticisms. And the number one criticism of qualitative research from the quantitative paradigm has to do with generalizability. Qual researchers tend to have sample sizes that are very small, sometimes, n equals one participant, which is inadequate for making generalizations to a population. But you know what? That's not really even what we're trying to do anyway.
Gross! Freaking idiot!
So we're going to come back to the validity chapter on chapter 11 and do the second half now. But let me be upfront with you. This is probably my least favorite chapter in the textbook for qualitative research. Johnson and Christensen, they're pretty clearly quantitative guys. And I think in this chapter they really let their bias kind of show through. So I'm going to spend at least some of the time kind of criticizing some of their perspectives, and hopefully you'll just bear with me. And as you're reviewing these notes, it's up to you as the student to weigh all these sides of the discussion and decide how that fits into your personal experience of research. Does it make sense to you? Or, what makes sense to you? So a good place to start when we're talking about qualitative research is subjectivity. This seems to be a major fighting point for quantitative researchers. So here's the deal with the qualitative perspective on subjectivity. It's natural. People are going to have perspectives because we're all actual human beings doing this research.
I'm not a robot without emotions. I'm not what you see. I've come to help you with your problems so we can be free.
In other words, the researchers themselves are going to be the instruments of data collection and analysis. In the context of qualitative research, denying the researcher's subjective position and trying to fake some kind of objectivity is dishonest and distorting to the research. Instead, qualitative researchers practice self-reflexivity. Now, they do this in part to monitor their own reactions to the research, but also in order to present them transparently to their readers. Effectively, what they're saying is, this is who I am and this is the perspective I bring to the research. That way, when you're reading it, you can judge how credible you find the researcher to be. Now, conceptually, this isn't really that different from quantitative research. In either case, it needs to be clear to the reader exactly how the data was collected and analyzed. You do that in quantitative research, you also do that in qualitative research. So in quantitative research, we collect data through instruments such as tests or assessments, and we analyze it through statistical operations. And it's important for the researcher to describe these instruments in a lot of detail so that the readers have an understanding of how conclusions have been produced. Now, in qualitative research, the researcher themselves is the instrument, and therefore, when you're describing the instrument, you're describing yourself, your own subjective position. And again, it's all about understanding how the conclusions in the research have been produced through this instrument, being the researcher themselves. Aiming for objectivity while inevitably occupying a subjective position is dishonest. And that runs kind of counter to something that Johnson and Christensen say in the textbook, which is the main issue regarding validity in qualitative research is researcher bias. That's what they say. I don't agree with that. Qualitative research should be credible, it should be trustworthy, and rigorous. And that's similar, but also very different from the quantitative idea of validity. Quantitative researchers value objectivity and neutrality above all. They want to limit the extraneous variables that could influence the results of their studies. And subjectivity for a quantitative researcher is a major extraneous and potentially confounding variable. Therefore, when there's subjectivity in the research for a quantitative researcher, it amounts to a distortion of the truth and has to be minimized. Okay? So to be clear, for quantitative researchers, subjectivity and bias are the same thing, they're equivalent. However, when we flip over to the qualitative paradigm, qual researchers dismiss the idea that objectivity is even possible, let alone an ideal that should be pursued. Qualitative researchers are embodied. That means they reside within specific subjectivities. Our participants, too, also have specific and unique subjective positions that they operate from. We as researchers have them, and our readers will inevitably possess their own unique subjectivity as well. To pretend otherwise and to pursue this myth of objectivity would be dishonest research for a qualitative researcher. It's a distortion of the truth of these subjective experiences. Remember that qualitative research is all about finding out about the lived experience of our participants. So think about this for a minute. In the quantitative paradigm, subjectivity is bias. But in the qualitative paradigm, objectivity is bias. So when Johnson and Christensen say things like the problem with qualitative research is that the researchers find what they want to find and then write up their results, that's kind of misleading. That's something that any researcher in any paradigm would want to guard against. And you should keep in mind that even in quantitative studies that are supposedly objective, the questions that we ask and the ways that we operationalize our variables, the choices we make about which objective instruments to use to collect the data, those are all subjective choices that are going to shape the data in some way or other. They'll elicit certain kinds of responses and discourage others. So if we're being completely honest here, there's really no such thing as objective research, and especially not in the social sciences. So as I was saying, bias looks very different in quantitative and qualitative research. The way that qualitative researchers manage their subjectivity is through self-reflexivity, self-awareness, and transparency. Instead of denying their subjective position, they put it out in the open and make it very explicit. This is where I'm coming from.
Boogie jobbing rap is life where I'm from. Where I'm from, I might play with Izzy where I'm from. Where I'm from, it be like run your coat black. Jupiter keeps a fat beats by the pack where I'm from. Nappy hair is like, we be reading Marx where I'm from. The kids be rocking Clarks where I'm from. You turn around your cap, you talk over a beat, and dig some sounds booming out of Jeep where I'm from.
And when they do this, the reader is made aware of how that subjectivity could have influenced the results of the study. And when they do this, the reader is made aware of how that subjective position has influenced the way that the researcher is making meaning or making sense of the data. The reader can then make informed decisions about the transferability, not generalizability, transferability and credibility of the research. Now, if you as a reader come across a piece and it seems like the researcher is pushing a personal agenda, and is explicitly biased, to the point of asking leading questions or misrepresenting the data, not fully exploring the participants' experiences, just kind of cherry-picking different things, then of course that would be biased. But not all qualitative research is like that. In fact, a very minimal amount of qualitative research is like that. Qualitative research is, in fact, guided by rigor and standards. When researchers are able to account for their subjective positions and resist making any kind of grand, generalizable truth claims about populations from their findings, then qualitative research actually does have credibility. Next, in the text they talk about interpretive and descriptive validity, so let's get into that a little bit. What I want to do with that is I want to give you kind of an example and trace the path of information from reality to your reader's interpretation of it. Okay? So let's consider this. Just do sort of a thought experiment. You're reading a qualitative study about somebody's experience of being a first responder to a fire. We're going to start with reality. Now the participant, they showed up on the scene, there's smoke, there's screaming, there's flashing lights. These are things that actually happen. This is reality. But from a qualitative perspective, we don't actually have direct access to absolute reality. If we did, we'd be gods. Instead, what happens is that reality is interpreted through the perceptions of the participant at the time they're experiencing it. And so it's an embodied reality. It's the reality of our participant. And this reality is subjectively selected by whatever it is the participant is paying attention to at any given point in time. So it kind of creates a frame around reality. And many details are left out of the frame of perception. Maybe the sound of the birds, or the name of the company that manufactured the car across the road, or the brand of jeans worn by the guy leaning against the car smoking a cigarette. Those are also facts, and maybe in an objective sense, they could potentially be very relevant to what we're studying. But if the participant wasn't actually paying attention to them at the time, they're not going to be able to recall them later when you're interviewing them. And when we're doing a study like this, all we have to go on is what our participants are able to tell us, which means what they're able to remember or recall from the event. Now, this experience had happened in the past, right? At the time of the interview, the participant is reflecting back on their experience. So there's a factor of time between the event happening and the interview that occurs between the participant and the researcher. And during that time, a number of different factors can influence and alter the participant's memory of the event. For example, learning that the fire was set by an arsonist, or attending therapy for PTSD, or maybe just getting older, right? These are kind of like the history and maturation effects we were talking about a while back, right? These things, they do influence our memories. They change them. We call it reconstructive memory rather than recollective memory, right? We don't recall, we rebuild our memories of events.
I don't remember. I don't recall. I got no memory of anything at all. I don't remember. I don't recall. I got no memory of anything at all.
Now we get to the point of the interview where I'm sitting down, with my participant, and I'm asking them questions about what happened. And they're telling me their story. And again, there's a selection process that happens within the participant. When they present their story, they don't necessarily present everything that they experienced at the time of the incident. They tell you what they think is the most important details, and they're going to highlight or emphasize certain details and maybe leave some of the other ones out. It's not necessarily to mislead or lie about things, as we all do this when we're telling stories. And we tell stories differently based on who we're telling the story to. I mean, you would tell a story differently to your parents versus a police officer versus, maybe a 5-year-old kid, right? You're going to use different language and include different details, depending on what you want to communicate and what you want to get across and that kind of thing. So the participant might want to present themselves as being like a hero in the story, right? So they might leave out the sensation of feeling kind of afraid when they entered the building, right? They want to present themselves as brave. In other cases, the details may just not seem relevant, like seeing a nickel lying in the road when they're running across the street, It doesn't really matter for the story, even though that was part of their experience. At the same time, when they're telling the story, they may add details as well. For example, they might compare the smoke from the fire to smoke they saw on TV, during the first Iraq War. And then, like I said, because of reconstructive memory, we're rebuilding the story. So they might invent details that they believe are likely to be true, even if they don't directly remember them. There have actually been some recent stories in the last few years about police interrogation techniques and how they can create false memories in people and lead them to confess to crimes that they didn't actually commit. So that's all happening in the participant's memory, right? And the participant is telling us. Now, in communication studies, there's a term, it's called noise. And noise is the error of message transmission. It's a distortion between what someone tells and what another person actually understands or hears. Language is kind of an imperfect system of communication. I should just be able to beam my thoughts into your head. But we have to use this medium of words and language. And that's highly prone to the effects of misunderstanding or reinterpretation of what I mean. Now, usually it's not really a huge problem because we seem to figure out generally what's meant by what's being said. But it's not a precise understanding, it's not perfect. Now, qualitative researchers doing the research, they use actually a variety of strategies to overcome this problem. If you look on page 301, table 11.2, it's a pretty good overview of these strategies to make sure that the researcher is actually understanding what the participant is saying and to maintain the rigor of qualitative research studies. That part Johnson and Christensen got right. So we've done the interview and we've heard the participant's story. Maybe we've probably recorded it on like a video camera or at least audio, right? And transcribed it. And so now we get to the point of doing data analysis. And in data analysis, the researcher is looking for patterns and themes within the data. And so not everything that has been recorded is necessarily interesting. In fact, probably quite a bit of it is not very useful at all. The researcher actually makes subjective choices about what's relevant in answering their research question. It's up to them to figure out how all the pieces fit together to solve the research puzzle, right? In order to make sense of the experience. Now, one strategy, because this is a very highly subjective process, is to take your findings and go back to your participant to review, for accuracy or to make sure that, what you found in your research isn't too far away from what they've actually experienced. This is called member checking. So once you've done all of this analysis and you've gone back and you've checked with your participants, finally you're going to write everything up into kind of a formal article. And this involves another translation process where you're translating the data into a written publication. And so, there are inevitably more distortions and noise interference that is occurring in this process because we're now influenced by the conventions of written language and academic writing. Who's going to be the audience for this article? And generally, when you're submitting to a journal, there will be a peer review process, so you'll have an editorial panel that will give you a bunch of feedback and suggest some more changes to your article. But eventually, at the end of this entire process, the article's finally going to get printed and distributed, right? Which is cool, that's what you've been working for. But keep in mind that everybody who's been involved, from the participant to you as the researcher to the editors, everybody has had a sort of a unique perspective or subjective lens that they've been able to kind of perceive the events through. Remember that reality way back, back there, right? Everybody's had kind of a different perspective on it. And you have your own subjective lens that you make sense of the participant's experience as relayed through the researcher and the writing. So how much objective truth do you think you're getting as a reader through this process? Now, the good news is that qualitative researchers tend to be aware of all these potential distortions, and they work either to minimize their impact or make them transparent. So if not presenting the truth with a capital T, they can at least make you aware of the potential limitations of the reproduction of truthfulness, which is, like I said, called transparency. And that way, you as a reader can make informed decisions about how you want to interpret and make sense of their research. Now, once again, we can see this is a totally different way of thinking about doing research than you'd find with the quantitative studies. For some, this process might seem pretty natural. Others of you might have a more difficult time grasping this way of understanding validity, right? Mostly it's important to recognize that the standards of validity in quantitative and qualitative research are not congruent with each other. You shouldn't apply one to the other. Now, both research methodologies seek accurate results. However, the ways that they define accurate are different. For a quantitative researcher, accuracy is determined in relation to an unbiased representation of objective reality. The introduction of subjectivity is a distortion to reality and a threat to accuracy. On the other hand, qualitative researchers are interested in studying rich experiences. For them, accuracy is determined in their representation of subjective experience, which are co-constructed between them and the participant. Subjective or emotional truths are often valued over factual truths, and objectivity then is distorting of this reality and a threat to their accuracy for qualitative research. So let me give you an example. Clinically, we might diagnose somebody as having cancer. Now, objectively stated, cancer is the uncontrollable growth of abnormal cells in the body, and we can measure this through a series of medical tests. But nobody ever experiences cancer this way. What they experience is pain and discomfort and anxiety, doctor's visits, stigmatization, confrontation with mortality, chemotherapy and the nausea and the weakness and the hair loss and all of that goes along with it, Now, both of these are true. Both of these are accurate, but they're true differently. So let's get back to transferability, because I don't think we've really explored that in depth. I know that the text says that you can kind of generalize qualitative results, but if you use generalizability and qualitative research together in the same sentence, you're going to be met with a lot of eye-rolling and exasperated sighing, and you might even be chased through the streets by a mob of qualitative researchers with pitchforks. So I wouldn't recommend it. Instead of generalizability, qualitative researchers use the term transferability, and these are two different concepts. Generalizability is the extent to which the results of a sample extend to the population. That's the goal of quantitative research. If you find that 9 out of 10 dentists recommend, brand X toothpaste, but it's only those specific 9 out of the 10 that you've studied, nobody's going to care about your study. You want what you find in your research to be true for everybody in your population, or at least as many people as possible. So in quantitative research, the researchers use statistical operations to determine how generalizable their results are, right? This is known as the statistical significance level. Quantitative researchers view generalizability as a property of the research itself. It stands alone. It's inherent to the study. They tell you how to generalize, and they tell you who it applies to. So far, so good. We understand this. We've covered this in previous chapters. Now, qualitative research, like I said, uses transferability. Remember that qualitative researchers view participants and their experiences as being unique. Therefore, what's found to be true in one case is not readily generalizable to others, let alone an entire population. Transferability refers to the ability of readers of the research to take away meaningful messages from the research, from the article. Where generalizability was a property of the research itself, transferability is co-constructed between the researcher and the reader. And each reader may find different things that are meaningful about the research, which they can apply to their own experiences. So they're able to transfer lessons from the study to their own lives. But it's not entirely out of the researcher's hands to establish transferability. To increase transferability, it's important that the research be done credibly. If I, as a reader, believe that you've been leading your participants or have been dishonest about your research, it's not likely I'm going to take much of value away from it.
Hello, my name is Tommy Flanagan, and I'm a member of Pathological Liars Anonymous. In fact, I'm the president of that organization. Yeah, that's who I am. I didn't always lie. No, I used to tell the truth. But then one day I told a lie and I got away with it. Yeah. Told my parents I had a brother that they'd never met. They got mad at me for not telling them sooner. And they kicked me out of the house. Yeah, that's what happened.
But that's a judgment that I, as the reader, have to make. Another way that qualitative researchers increase the transferability is by increasing the accessibility to the research. Meaning there are more entry points for readers to come in and make their own meanings. And sometimes, but not always, this requires that researchers resist drawing simple, concrete solutions to their research questions. Instead, they may leave conclusions somewhat unresolved and ambiguous for the readers to puzzle out. We've gone out, we've collected our data, we've represented it in a way that's accessible and detailed for readers to engage with and make their own meanings from. But it's maybe up to the reader to decide what specific meaning they want to take away from the study. Of course, that depends a lot on the researcher's own orientation towards doing qualitative research. Some qualitative researchers really do prefer to make more concrete conclusions, and I think some readers really prefer to have more concrete conclusions when they're reading. And the focus of qualitative research is exploratory, and the product of a qualitative research study should be a rich description of a phenomenon in as much detail as possible. We want to know what the experiences of our participants are like. Because qualitative research focuses on answering open rather than closed-ended questions, we're aimed at expanding definitions of what we're studying rather than reducing them to a single numeric conclusion. One example I use for this is the DSM. Okay. Big book of diagnoses, right? And you can flip to any kind of disorder, and there's a checklist of symptoms that you would have to read through, and you can check off and say, yes, the patient has this, and the client has this, and this, and this. Therefore, they qualify as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, for example. And so, what we're starting with is a broad sort of experience with the symptoms, right, and reducing it down to a diagnosis, right, a single thing. Now, for qualitative researchers, what we're interested in doing is taking that diagnosis, the food intake disorder, and finding out exactly how the participant has experienced that disorder. And so we're trying to expand our definition rather than arrive at a single diagnosis. Now, unfortunately, Johnson and Christensen, for some reason, decided to leave out transferability, but it's like central to the process of conducting qualitative research. Instead, what Johnson and Christensen say is external validity tends to be a weakness of qualitative research. Well, it's technically true, but it's also totally beside the point, right? We don't criticize quantitative researchers for having limited transferability because they reduce multiple human experiences to a single numeric value called the mean. That would be stupid, wouldn't it? The purpose of quantitative research is not to explore, in depth the unique experiences of the participants, right? That's the purpose of qualitative research. Qualitative research is not equipped to find general truths, and it doesn't even care about, extending them across populations. It's about as dumb as, criticizing a sumo wrestler for not being able to figure skate.
Oh, that's lovely.
So graceful.
The corkscrew spin, flawless. His signature move, the Flying Dutchman. Poetry in motion.
And there it is, the baby bird.
Yeah, that's not what they're about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about theoretical validity. Now, it should be clear by now that qualitative research is conducted from a particular subjective perspective, right? Subjectivity. However, which one? Once we abandon the positivist, objectivist myth that guides quantitative research, we then become accountable for a selection of a theoretical lens through which we approach our research project. What theories are we going to use to drive our research and make sense of our data? Are we going to be interested in critical theories, like critical race theory, or transnational theories, or queer theories? These look at structures of power and discrimination and usually have a heavy emphasis on social justice issues. Or do we want to break apart and deconstruct assumptions, showing how power knowledge has been constructed and how it functions? Or are we interested in exploring the phenomenological essence of a phenomenon? Or how meanings are constructed in relation to such phenomenon? So there are a lot of different ways of looking at any given phenomenon or issue that you want to study. But just because research is subjective doesn't mean that anything goes. Qualitative research should be firmly grounded in a perspective, some perspective. And that means that you're going to need to have a strong foundation in theory or philosophy that guides how you understand the production of knowledge, which is epistemology, and truth, or reality, which is ontology. When you're able to situate what you're doing in a firm theoretical context, that's going to give you more credibility as a researcher. You're not just making things up as you go along. You actually have some reasons for doing what you're doing, or observing what you're observing. So, table 11.2 and 11.3, both of those are pretty good lists of strategies for qualitative researchers and what they do to create rigor in their studies. There's also an article by Tracy that discusses the criteria by which you can evaluate the quality of qualitative research. I'd recommend reading that. That's pretty good information there. And so, before we move on to sampling, to sort of end this note, I wanted to talk a little bit, just briefly, about mixed methods, because we haven't talked about them for a while. I don't think we're actually covering them, but as I said earlier, mixing the methods doesn't really make much sense until you're firmly grounded in quantitative and qualitative research, because you don't know what it is you're mixing. But you should beware anybody who's trying to sell you mixed methods under this best of both worlds rationale.
I never really thought about it.
Think hard. The first hit's free, but you find me when you need more. The choice is yours.
What do you think? Nah, this just not with the time.
They'll say things like Johnson and Christensen do about complementary strengths and things like that, but what they don't tell you is that mixed methods also opens you up to complementary weaknesses. Now, I've been saying that we should avoid making these kind of cross-paradigm criticisms because they're kind of dumb, right? However, when you're using mixed methods, you actually invite these kinds of criticisms to your study. The quantitative people will disagree with the qualitative elements of your study. The qualitative people will disagree with the quantitative elements of your study, and you have to justify them all and make both sides happy. That's not impossible, but it is very hard. So mixed methods researchers need to very carefully and thoughtfully think through how the methods are blended in a way that's valid. And that's unique to the mixed methods approach. Quantitative and qualitative research, on the other hand, are standalone approaches, and they're actually kind of contradictory methods. A mixed methods researcher can't just pick and choose randomly from one side or the other. They need to present a clear rationale of how the methods are going to be blended together in the context of their study in order to answer the particular research question. Therefore, you need to have a very firm understanding of quantitative and qualitative separately, and also sort of the philosophies that underpin them. And that all adds just another extra layer of validity to worry about, as if you didn't have enough to deal with already. Okay, so let's finish up with sampling in qualitative research. As I said earlier, quantitative research is about describing broad trends in a population. Qual research, on the other hand, is about describing in depth the lived experiences of particular individuals. It begins with the assumption that everyone's experience is unique and non-comparable.
You never met a mother quite like me.
And it doesn't usually place a lot of value in finding a consensus between these different experiences in order to establish some kind of objective big T truth that can be applied broadly. Now, quantitative and qualitative researchers approach data collection differently. A quantitative researcher might give a questionnaire with 100 items, and that's a pretty long questionnaire. And when their participant completes the questionnaire, all they get from that is 100 unique, probably numeric data points. Okay, so 100 numbers. Now, these data are collected from hundreds, if not thousands, of participants, right? But when we take all of these numbers, what we do is we aggregate them. We calculate averages, we calculate standard deviations, and so on. And in that way, we describe the sample as a whole. Therefore, in the quantitative process, it's necessary to have a pretty large sample. Now, in contrast, a qualitative researcher might spend an hour interviewing a participant, and at the end of the hour, they're going to generate about 25 pages of rich text data for analysis. 25 pages of data versus 100 numbers.
Words to memorize, words hypnotize, words make my mouth exercise.
And that's from a single participant in a single 1-hour interview. Very often, qualitative researchers are going to conduct multiple interviews. Usually it's not just a one-and-done kind of thing with the same participant, or they may have several different participants that they're going to interview. And in addition, they also may conduct observations or analyze some documents, photographs, and things like that. So From a few participants, or even just one participant, you can generate a massive, massive amount of data. And the point is not just to sort of reduce everything to a few key descriptive numbers, but to examine the phenomenon from all sides or multiple angles, so that you're getting a full understanding of participants' experiences as possible. And that means searching for more details. With quantitative researchers, the stopping point for data collection is when they've collected all of the data from a predetermined number of participants in their sample. For qualitative researchers, on the other hand, the stopping point for data collection is a little bit more ambiguous. It's known as data saturation. Data saturation occurs when collecting new data doesn't add significantly to the researcher's understanding of the phenomenon or experience being studied. So, for example, if I'm studying bullying from a phenomenological approach, which we'll talk about in another set of notes, I might want to recruit about 35 participants, which is kind of a lot for a qualitative study, and then I'm going to interview each of them. However, after a while, maybe by like the 25th interview, or maybe sooner, right, I might find that they're essentially telling me the same stories, right? The characters might change, the settings might change, but the underlying events and the mechanisms of bullying and things may end up being pretty similar across these different accounts. And so at this point, I'd have reached data saturation. There's nothing to be learned from interviewing more people and having that same story told to me again. So because of the depth and the richness and the sheer volume of data collected from each participant in qualitative research, there's no point in getting, these massive samples. Furthermore, because qualitative research isn't much concerned about variables or controlling them, random sampling is pretty ineffective as a method of sampling. Instead, qualitative researchers tend to use purposeful sampling strategies. They're specifically seeking participants who are likely to be rich sources of data for their study. What would be the point of taking a random sample and just hoping that somebody in the sample has an experience of being a bully? Why wouldn't I just go out and find somebody who I know is a bully and is going to be able to speak to that experience? In some cases, qualitative research might even be sparked by a personal acquaintance. Somebody I know has an interesting story and I've decided to document it. This is called opportunistic sampling. So if I was working at a school and one of my students bullied another one, I might be curious to find out why, and I'd conduct a study, with that student. Now, quantitatively speaking, this would undoubtedly create sampling bias. You would never do this in a quantitative study. However, from a qualitative perspective, it's fine, because I'm interested in that student's perspective in itself, not as a representation of a population. The qualitative sampling strategies that are described in the text are kind of limited. They only really apply to some situations and not others. They seem to be really focused on doing case study research. Now, a case is a specific bounded system. It's a particular place or event or group. And within each case, you'll decide whether you want sort of a comprehensive sample of everyone who's involved in the case, or whether you're interested in particular viewpoints in the case, sort of a homogeneous sample, or diverse viewpoints, which is a heterogeneous sample, or maximum variation sampling, or just those who are deemed most important, which is a critical case sampling. Do you want to look at the most extreme perspectives or just typical ones, These are kind of choices that you have to make as a researcher. Now, negative case sampling is actually a method for providing rigor to a qualitative study. It's not actually and it's kind of a sampling strategy as well. When we're doing a case study or we're doing grounded theory research, and we've got some primary conclusions that we've made from the data, after we've analyzed it, we'll often go out and seek cases that specifically contradict what we've found to see if they're out there. Now, the point of doing this is not necessarily to disprove our conclusions. Instead, it's to expand our understanding and limit generalizations. In this way, we kind of make sure all sides of the case are represented. Then we could say some people view this from X perspective, but the others view it from Y perspective, right? As opposed to everybody views it from X perspective. So that basically covers the sampling strategies and the rigor. Like I said, take what Johnson and Christensen have written with, a grain of salt, but have a look at that Tracy article as well. I think that'll sort of expand on how qualitative researchers establish rigor in their studies.